Welcome to Sheep Suit, the home of grazable Christian thought. Today's Brain Graze: ask a preacher a question and see what happens. If you want a real adventure, if you can even pull this off. I'm going to tell two stories briefly from my past as to what happened when I did this. Many years ago, at a Bible study, I think back in the 80s, I was a much younger sheep, and one of the big teachings of that time was the rapture. Boy, it was so exciting to know that based on one or two scriptures, probably taken out of context, that when things got really bad, all us Christians were just going to disappear and meet God in the air or something like that, and we wouldn't really have to go through the tribulation. And I'm not even going to go into a long-winded Bible study. There's a famous passage, you can look it up yourself. You probably even heard this. One will be taken, the other left. Neato. And I sat through a Bible study on this, and I remember it being led by an official staff member in the congregation that I was part of. And I read the scripture myself, and after the study, I asked him, well, one will be taken and the other left, and the next verse was, or at least there was a question in the narrative, and then the next verse was, where the bodies lie, the vultures gather. And I asked, what is that about? Teacher didn't know, and I thought, okay, you just taught this lesson like you're some kind of authority, and I ask you about the next thing that happens in the narrative, and you don't know. Well, that stuck with me for quite a while. I realized that when the moment you speak up and ask a question of some of these church authorities, you find out they really don't know what they're talking about. More recently, year 2017-ish, a preacher at a church that I attended was preaching on Deuteronomy, and they said something that just sounded weird, and I can't even accurately relate what it was, but this preacher would actually stay among the congregation after the service and greet people. And I walked up to him and I asked him about this thing he said about Deuteronomy, and he said he'd get back to me. I've learned that when a person says they'll get back to you, that's a way of saying, I wish you'd go away and I never ever intend to get back to you. Well, the next week, I walked up there and I asked him again. I said, do you have an answer for me? And he got snippy and rude, and he said, how long are you going to sit on that? And I said, as long as it takes. And he realized I wasn't going to back down, and then he said he really didn't know. And I realized, okay, you taught something from the pulpit, you didn't know what you're talking about. What an adventure. If you can, the next time you're sitting through a sermon and you hear something that sounds a little weird, have the courage to get up there, if you can, and ask your preacher how they got what they taught. What's their source? How did they arrive at that conclusion? Now, in many cases, you simply won't be able to do that because preachers are like rock stars. They have a band to hypnotize people before they get on stage so that people will be open to anything they say, and then they talk as if they're the voice of God, and then they vanish. Just try and even get to them to ask a question. That's not supposed to happen. But some churches maybe are a little less event-centric. Maybe they're a little more open. Maybe the leadership is a little more accessible. Maybe they do hang around a little bit afterwards. Well, next time you hear something that's a little off, walk up there, don't be afraid. Ask exactly why they taught what they did. See how they treat you. Maybe they'll treat you great. Maybe they'll invite inquiry. And maybe not. And maybe you'll learn something. Maybe something that'll save you years of being committed to someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, who just preaches for effect, whatever works. Anyway, that's a very short brain graze. Keep the wool out of your eyes.